So, Dr. Abu Sittah, welcome to Medicus. I think I speak for everyone here, and on behalf of Medicus, this is a historical day. We're truly honored and privileged to have you in Medicus. Thank you for giving us the time.
Thank you.
I'll begin from where you are right now. Walk us through your mind, what you're thinking about now, what you're reflecting on after your experience coming back from Gaza.
Unfortunately, the war is still going on. The carnage is still going on. Colleagues and friends are still there. Today, I received an audio message from a friend and a colleague who's an orthopedic surgeon at Al Hospital in the northern part of Gaza, saying that despite the repeated attacks on the hospital, they've managed to do 5 orthopedic procedures yesterday, and that they have another 5 planned for the day. My other colleague, who's a friend and a head of the plastic surgery department at Shifa, posted something on Twitter that he has 400 patients waiting for surgery at the European hospital in southern Gaza. And so your mind cannot kind of go far. You know, yesterday, over the last 48 hours, the Israelis have killed over 100 people in air raids. And so your mind is still there with the wounded. And everything that you do has to do with trying to alleviate the suffering and trying to help and see how we can think about what would happen once there is a ceasefire, and how we could be ready to respond to the needs of over 55,000 wounded.
Doctor, going back just a little, when you received the news of Gaza, how did you react and what did you do?
So it was the night of Saturday, the 7th of October, I realized that the war was going to happen. And even then I thought it would be a bad version of the 2014 war, but nothing like I thought it would, nothing like what transpired. And so I got in touch with the MSF team that I always get in touch with, and by Sunday morning I had my tickets to go to Egypt. Sunday night I was in Egypt. Monday morning on the 9th of October I was at Rafah border. And because I always believe that there's a small window in these wars where you can get in and out at the beginning of the war, and you need to kind of not hesitate, or else the shutters will come down.
Doctor, I'm going to ask a question just for the people outside to visualize what it is exactly on the reality there. Can you give us, I know it might be hard, but can you walk us through a regular day in Gaza? When do you wake up, if you ever sleep? How do you get your food? How do you get things done? Do you pre-round or round on your patients?
So when I was at Shifa Hospital, I was part of the plastic surgery department, and things had been organized that there's a team that rounds, and then myself and the head of the department would be in the operating room. We would go out to see certain patients or to go to other operating rooms to assist other specialties. The team that then rounds, then we have a paper round. We sit down, we go through the list. We decide, unfortunately, the number was so far exceeding the ability to operate that we kind of picked those most urgent for surgery. And then we would create an operating list for the day, and probably a couple of days later, like a waiting list of patients. And the day I'd wake up at 6, the day would start at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and we'd operate continuously till 1 o'clock in the morning, or until we lost the anaesthetist, because sometimes there were such shortage of anaesthetists that we didn't have an anaesthetist. Around 1 o'clock when we finish, used to clean up, assist the domestic worker who cleans the operating room, and one of the recovery room trolleys I'd put in the operating room, and I'd go to sleep. During the day, you take half an hour to get your lunch, And as there, it's kind of interspersed with people asking you to see some patients to make a decision about whether they need to go to the operating room. The days where we didn't have an anaesthetist, we would go to the emergency department and help out in the emergency department, and that was a much more emotionally taxing experience, just for the sheer number and the chaos and the number of killed and wounded being brought in.
Doctor, I'm gonna make use of specific events that mark this crisis in Gaza right now. On Thursday night, October 17, Israeli missiles have bombed Al Ahli hospital, killing at least 500 civilians that took from the hospital as a shelter. Where were you exactly when this happened, and can you walk us through these moments exactly?
So I'd been operating at Al Ahli all day that day, and in the evening we were wheeling one patient out of the operating rooms and about to get the next one in, when the screeching sound of an incoming missile, and then a huge explosion. The false ceiling in the operating room fell. And I remember walking out, and there were people screaming everywhere, and eventually made it to the emergency department. The first patient that I saw on the ground had a primary amputation at the mid-thigh and was bleeding through the stump. I took his belt and I used it as a tourniquet, and then went and got someone's shirt and used it as a secondary tourniquet for him to stop the bleeding, and then got a cannula for him and some IVs. And then I went to the next patient. He had a shrapnel in his neck and had hit one of the vessels and was just spurting blood out of his neck. I applied pressure to him until I found someone to take my place, and then put a cannula in, set him up, started resuscitating him, and then we took him out on a stretcher when the ambulance came. We walked out into the courtyard where a lot of the families had been taking shelter, and that's when you saw the whole place was on fire. There were hundreds of bodies on the ground. There are amputated parts of people, and that was the and then we took him to Shifa Hospital, and that's when the rest of the wounded were being brought in.
How did you react when you heard the narrative that the missile was a Palestinian missile that bombed the Ahli hospital?
The speed with which that narrative was completely and uncritically accepted by Western media, for me, I immediately saw the choice of Al Ahli Hospital, a hospital that was linked with the World Council of Churches, had links with the Anglican Church in the UK. It was the Israelis were testing world opinion about targeting the health system. And so when that narrative was so uncritically accepted and unquestionably accepted, I realized that the Israelis were going to start dismantling the whole health system, as they've always wanted to do, because the world had failed in that litmus test of the attack on Al Ahli Hospital.
عن بعد يا حمدان، عن بعد يا حمدان، عن بعد. المشاهد مؤلمة، المشاهد مروعة، والمشاهد لا تحتمل حقيقة. هي مجزرة الجثامين في كل مكان كما تلاحظون عن بعد. هذه أماكن الناس النازحين في هذا المكان. عن بعد يا حمدان لو سمحت. هنا كانوا لجأوا إلى أروقة هذه المستشفى.
This morning, when I drove into the hospital, I noted how full the hospital courtyard was, with families who had sought refuge inside the hospital, thinking that it would be a safe haven. It's these very same families who are now either dead or critically wounded as a result of this attack. This is a war crime that the world has seen coming. Israel has been warning the entire world that it was going to attack Palestinian hospitals, and it did exactly that.
Doctor, up until what date were you in the Shifa hospital?
So what would happen is the first time I left Shifa was early in the war. I was asked to go to Al-Auda Hospital in Jabalia to help the orthoplastic team at Al-Auda Hospital. I stayed there for 3 or 4 days. I came back to Shifa. Stayed there. The day of the massacre at Al-Ahli, I was asked to go to Al-Ahli to help out there, to help relieve some of the pressure at Shifa. And then after the massacre, I went back to Shifa. And then a week later, they had fixed part of Al-Ahli Hospital, at least the 2 operating rooms and the ground floor wards. And the day the Israelis completely surrounded Al-Shifa Hospital, I was traveling back from Al-Ahli to Shifa when we saw the Israeli tanks completely encircle Al-Shifa Hospital. The last 10 days of the war I spent in Al-Ahli when Al-Ahli became the only hospital in Gaza city that was functioning.
Okay.
Doctor, from first-hand witness who lived in that hospital, can you tell us about your thoughts concerning that the hospital was being used as a military base in which underground tunnels were devised and built?
I had been in Shifa in 2014 during the war when the Israelis started circulating this kind of narrative. And anybody who works in Shifa, it was obvious that there was nothing there. I mean, I walked freely around the hospital all of the time, trying to get the consumables that I needed for my patients, and I was never stopped or told not to go into an area. And so it was obvious that this was a narrative, and most importantly, while the Israelis were basically talking about Shifa Hospital, they were quietly destroying 4 pediatric hospitals. So by the time the Israelis had actually gotten round to encircling the Shifa Hospital, they destroyed 4 pediatric hospitals, an ophthalmology hospital, a psychiatric hospital, and the Al-Quds Hospital, which is part of the Palestine Red Crescent Society. And so the Shifa was just a distraction while the rest of the system was being taken apart. And when they got round to Shifa Hospital, it was obvious that they didn't find anything. They tried to engineer in a kind of very ham-fisted way some magazines around MRIs, but it was obvious that there was nothing of what they had described.
Did they make contact with you, doctor, as did they send specific threats, or you just woke up and you realized that Israelis tanks are surrounding and circling the hospital?
From the very beginning, there was shelling around the hospital, and so it happened in a kind of incremental way. When the land invasion started, the Israelis had already been shelling most of the buildings around the hospital, and so there was no. I mean, they also had been calling the administrators of every hospital in Gaza, threatening them that unless they evacuated the hospital would be targeted.
I just want to, doctor, reflect on your in your previous interviews. You mentioned how the experience when you tried to leave Al-Shifa Hospital and you went through that road that was heavily monitored by Israelis authorities. For the audience who doesn't know the story and the experience, can you briefly tell us how did you leave Al-Shifa Hospital and how was it like going from Al-Shifa? Evacuating from Al-Shifa Hospital.
So it was after Al-Ahli Hospital collapsed, or at least the operating rooms ran out of medication for us to do any anesthetic procedures. We decided that we can leave Al-Ahli. There was nothing left to do in the operating room, and we walked for 6 hours. Part of that is through a road that the Israelis had designated as the safe passageway between the north and the south. And as you walk, you're monitored by the Israelis. There are cameras, there's snipers, there are soldiers with binoculars, basically with facial recognition software, because they would be arresting people from around you during that walk. And it was a very humiliating and intentionally humiliating walk where thousands of people were being forced to march in very difficult circumstances in front of the Israeli soldiers.
Doctor, when did you manage? How did you manage to leave Gaza, and when did you decide to do so?
So once I got to northern Gaza, I joined one of the smaller hospitals in Sirat, to southern Gaza. I joined one of the smaller hospitals in Sirat camp, and in the last 2 days, I was just doing dressing changes. There was no anesthetic. There was so short of resources in the hospitals in the south that I realized that the problem is no longer a shortage of surgeons, but a shortage of capacity in the system to deal with the wounded, and that I was no longer of much use being in Gaza. And that's when I set forward, I reached out to the Foreign Office in the UK and to the Jordanian government, who arranged for me to leave the Gaza.
Reflecting on your experience there, Doctor, in previous tweets you've mentioned that there is nothing more lonely in the world than a wounded child who has no remaining family member to take care of him or her. Can you tell us if this is the most stretching experience or moment you had from this war?
So by the time Shifa fell, there was around 120 of these kids. They had been taken out from under the rubble. They were wounded. There was no one, multiple generations of parents, uncles, aunts, grandparents who had been killed when their residential buildings were targeted. And you could always tell in the emergency department, they're the ones in a stretcher with no one around them. And whereas everybody has family screaming and crying, and there's a lot of commotion, and then in a corner there's a child that has a kind of, has this emptiness around them. And then became a phenomenon. You'd see it over and over and over again. You'd operate on children who have no one to look after them. And it becomes, even now, I wonder what happened to these children.
In those moments, what was the most intimidating moment you thought you were really close to lose your life?
There's a moment when you realize that there's a really strong chance that you're not going to make it, and you make peace with that. There was a night where the Israelis had this big conference, press conference about the tunnels underneath Shifa and all of these diagrams, and then they switched off all of the communications into Gaza, so we were cut off. And then they started shelling the buildings around Shifa, and then firing missiles, firing artillery shells over the hospital. And that's the moment where I made peace with the idea that most likely it's not going to happen, that you're going to be dying in this war, and it's fine. You've made your bed, you lie in it. And it frees you. It frees you from the worry and the fear every time there's an explosion, because you've kind of almost like you've crossed to another part where you're at peace with your decisions, and you're at peace with what happens.
Did it ever come, Doctor, do you ever come in contact with Israeli soldiers or, Zionists on the street? If there was any arguments or discussions being alternated or?
No, you saw their handiwork. We had people shot by quadcopter drones that have sniper guns attached to them. We could hear the tanks moving around the hospitals, but we never came across the soldiers.
Doctor, now being a global figure and a main icon, if you may say, advocating for this situation in Palestine, aren't you afraid to be specifically followed and targeted like it happened with so many others? I know it might seem silly asking you this question, a doctor in UK whose reflex was to go into the war and help people there. But sometimes we wonder, especially from the stories we hear and witness, aren't you afraid to be specifically followed and targeted?
There's been a campaign by some pro-Israeli and Zionist groups on the internet and some of their newspapers. but you always tell yourself, يعني, you know, people have paid much more heavily for this war. That whatever happens to you pales in comparison to what people have had to pay, and you just accept that this is your burden of this catastrophe that has befallen your people.
What did it cost you, Doctor, personally and professionally? The stance you're taking and the impact you're leaving and creating. What did it cost you on the personal level and on the professional level?
For me, it didn't. I mean, it's the wrong question to ask in terms of. I wouldn't have done it any other way. I think, had I not gone, the torment of watching this catastrophe unfold in front of me would have been devastating. And I think, you know, it's a kind of natural trajectory to the way I've always wanted to lead my life. It wasn't a kind of sudden, out of character, spur of the moment decision. I've been doing it. It just happened that this war became different. But this was my 7th war in Gaza.
Friends, how is your family handling all this?
My children are used to it. They grew up with it. I mean, I was, you know, when in the 2014 they were very young when I went to Gaza for the first time after they were born, and so it's always been part of the discussions that we've had in the family that, you know, you have to grow up with a sense of duty, and this is your duty towards your people, and you have to be there. And I think that's why they handled it very well. I think they've done very well. I hope that we've raised them with a sense of duty, and it comes from a sense of duty. I mean, at the end of the day, you have a set of skills that are very useful, and that these set of skills are in scarce supply in this place, and that's the normal place that you have to be, because it's wajib.
You've mentioned, Doctor, previously that your family reports actually have been circulated that your family house has been visited by UK authorities, police authorities, and they've been under many questioning whether you get any foreign finances or support or whatsoever. Can you tell us exactly how about this experience more?
So when I was in Shifa Hospital, I got a message from my wife that the anti-terrorist police had come to the house and questioned her about why I was in Gaza and who paid for the tickets and which organization that I was with. And it's really part of the harassment and the silencing of pro-Palestinian voices that's happening across not just Europe, but North America, and we see it in academia, we see it in all walks of life. And that was, you know, it was critical. That's why it was critical for me to kind of very quickly, when I was interviewed that night on the BBC, to kind of say that this is what's happening, because these people work in the dark and they prefer to work in the dark, and so when you kind of, you know, shine the light on them, they disappear, and that's what made it go away.
Doctor, you previously mentioned that one of the main aims of this war is to create a self-sustaining catastrophe. I'm quoting you here exactly. And one of the main pillars of this creation is that this demolition of the health system. Ironically enough, Netanyahu, I guess 2 days ago, he mentioned in the Likud conference that now their goal and their aim is to encourage the voluntarily displacement of people. Can you tell the people more about this thought and how this process is being done?
So the aim is what you can't achieve during the war, is that after the war you make Gaza so uninhabitable that people have to sit and watch their wounded children die in front of them, that there are no schools, that there's no houses, there are no universities, that people who have chosen to stay will leave. And that's exactly what he means by voluntary migration out of Gaza, that just make Gaza so unpleasant a place to live, with none of what people need for a basic quality of life, that people will leave. And that's the aim of the ceasefire, is once it happens, the Israelis through the siege will be able to do that.
I'm gonna, Doctor, elaborate here more. Where's the people's spirit from this, being under this reality? From someone who used to be there on the ground, how is their will and morals, and how would it shape this plan according to their wills and morals?
What the Israelis fail to understand is the Palestinian identity has been so shaped by the humiliation of becoming a refugee, that for Palestinians becoming a refugee and leaving Palestine is a fate worse than death. And that's what's keeping people in Gaza. There's no doubt that people will do what they find unacceptable to save their children. But a lot of what's happening in the north and in the south is related to the fact that Palestinians will never again accept to go through the humiliation of becoming refugees, that sense of non-belonging that stays with you for generations.
I'm gonna start my next question on that thought, Doctor, that you previously tweeted about. On November 15, you said that despite the unbearable pain and suffering, the heart-wrenching grief and the sea of blood, tears of severed limbs and broken bodies, I believe that we are closer today to victory than we have ever been since the process of Nakba that began 75 years ago. Can you tell us more about your view of the conflict? How do you expect it's gonna get unfolded, despite the political interest?
So, I mean, the Israelis have really, and not just the Israelis, the whole Zionist movement, which encompasses the Israelis and the Americans and the Europeans, have thrown into this war everything as a last attempt, because they have realized that despite 75 years of continuous attempts, they have not defeated the Palestinian people. And so the Israeli public and the Israeli institutions have come to the final solution frame of mind, that the only way is to wipe out the Palestinians. And so if we survive, if we are able to defeat this final throw of the dice by the Zionist movement, then we will be victorious, because that will be the end of that project and its inability to get rid of the Palestinian people.
Doctor, how do you see the global pressure demonstrating in the wide-ranging protests that taking place throughout the world? How do you see it will shape the conflict differently? Do you think it will have long-term consequences impacting the policies that controlling the conflict in Palestine?
There is no doubt that there has been a sea change in world opinion about Israel and its nature. And that this sea change we see in demonstrations in the hundreds of thousands in the UK, in Europe, in the United States. And that this sea change is creating a crisis in these democracies where people feel that their governments do not represent their opinions. And it's young people who have a different culture in which they believe that you find news yourself in social media rather than you receive the news from the mainstream media that have been spearheading this movement, because they have been exposed to the truth in ways that those generations who believe that you listen to the news and you get your news from CNN or BBC or Sky News, and so that is never going to be undone. despite the political position of the ruling elites in the West. That's never going to be undone, and that's going to be a crisis of Western democracies for a generation.
Doctor, we have couple of questions, and we'll be greedy enough to make use of them for exclusive news. Any plans of you coming back to AUB, or whether in the short-term future, long-term future?
And I've never really left the AUB. As you know, I'm I continue my position as the director of the conflict medicine program at the American University of Beirut's Global Health Institute, and this is my professional home. Like the rest of the region, I'm at a junction in my life. What has happened cannot be undone. I can't imagine going back to my life before the 9th of October. And so all options are still available to me. I'm trying to once this war ends, I don't think I can make any decisions or any plans until the killing stops and we're able to at least provide some kind of assistance to people in Gaza, and then we will take it from there. But certainly I've never left the AUB for that to happen.
Doctor, any advice to medical students, any notes regarding their importance, what they can do, and what exactly you feel their roles will fit in during this conflict?
And maybe advice to all people of our generation too.
I think with regards to advice, you become the doctor that you set out to be. And we're not talking about specialties or career choices, but the kind of human being who practices medicine in the way that you set out to be from the very beginning. And although there are exigencies of life that one cannot escape, there's also a sense of moral duty that comes with the nature of the profession, that no amount of commoditization of health or corporatization of medicine can ever undo. And that's a personal decision people need to make, and it's a decision people make at medical school because it's a path that they take for the rest of their lives.
Last question, Doctor from Hani.
Are you planning on documenting the surgical cases that you have encountered, or do you think you need any assistance in doing that? Because we believe that whatever has been encountered in Gaza should be shared, whether in the media or in the scientific community.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of projects that need to be in place. Unfortunately, they all have to wait till the war stops. There's a lot of lessons learned academically within the sphere of conflict medicine. This is the most vicious war encountered since the Second World War, and there's a lot that has happened that needs to be documented.
So, Dr. Ghassan Abu Sittah, it might be annoying to you, but I'll have to repeat what I said behind the scenes, because I think I'll speak on behalf of everyone within medical school, that you are on everyday convos within the students, and I believe perhaps within all of the medical community. You are not anymore an icon or a figure for the Palestinians. I believe the stance you've taken and the impact you're trying to make has made you an icon and an inspiring figure for everyone who hopes to ascend in his or her humanity. Honestly, I was trying to hide the news that I was going to interview today, because I know that so many students will try to come here, and I know you're too nice enough, you wouldn't say no, but I know it wouldn't be feasible and it would be a bit hard to handle. I think Medicus has made it into history, but I believe today and the day that your interview will be published is a major mark on its history, because if Medicus was proud, if it would be proud to have published or interviewed someone, I think you would be on the top of that list. thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're more
Thank
than
you.
grateful, and we're truly humbled, and we wish you all the safety and all
Thank
the
you
best.
so
God
much.
bless you.
You're very
Thank you so
kind.
much.